Donna, I think I'm turning the steering wheel back over to you.
Sounds good. Oh, this was so much fun to listen to, and I've taken a bunch of notes, and lots of things that I really do encourage us to keep the conversation going. There was a little bit back and forth as we were listening to that about the Slack channel. So that's a good place to go. And we posted some of the references and resources there. There's a Q&A in the Zoom. And so a few of our colleagues have been formally asking questions. That's great. We can both get our moderators to take a look at that. And then I'll be taking those and mining those for the kinds of conversations that we'll have at the end of the day. So if you see the little Q&A button somewhere down there, by all means, feel free to use it. And then of course the chat too. I'm still trying to get over the idea of mom as threat vectors and maybe thinking about insider threats differently than I had before after that conversation, which is a great segue into my colleague, Deborah Watson, who's going to be talking to us about the changing nature of insider threats. Deborah from Proofpoint, hello, welcome.
Hi, Donna, how are you today?
I'm doing great. Without much ado, I'm going to ask you introduce yourself to our esteemed colleagues here, and let's get this rolling.
Sure, awesome. So I'm happy to be here today. I'm Deborah Watson. I'm currently a resident CISO at Proofpoint, but I've been in IT and security for more than 20 years. And ITM is a really hot topic right now, so I'm excited to talk to you guys today. And I'm
there we go.
Works backwards of what I expected it to work, but it's working. So before we get started, I want you guys to take a look at this image. So what is the first thing you see? And if you want to put it in chat, I'd love to see it. But the purpose of this is to help you guys realize that there are actually two images in each of these squares. Some of you might see a column where, you know, the colored part is a column, whether it's the blue or the purple. Or if you look at the black, there's actually two people facing each other. The point of this is that there's two ways to see each of them. And when we talk about insider threats, there's a lot of discussion about, you know, the insider did this, they're careless, they're negligent. And my discussion today is going to come out this a little differently. And so I want you to think a little more open about, is the insider good? Is the insider bad? Or has the insider not been trained? And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's look at our first person. Her name is Cindy, and she's a brand new contractor. She works from home in the office, meaning sometimes she's remote, sometimes she's not. And she works in a lending department, handles sensitive data. And of course, she's going to do whatever is easy to get the job done because, well, she's a contractor, she charges hourly, she probably has a fixed rate, and she has a limited amount of time. So that's pretty normal, not an unusual scenario. But when Cindy went to work, some of the things that she decided to do were not okay. So as she started doing this, she needed some type of project management tool. Well, she went online, she got Smartsheet or some other solution. It wasn't approved for sensitive data at this company, but she didn't know that. I mean, they didn't give her a tool to use, so she was just doing the best she could. And then Cindy went and used some Teams and shared it with other people that she kind of networks with because she ran into an issue and wanted to get some advice. Again, it wasn't a corporate solution, and now that data is less the network. So the question here from an ITM perspective is she being risky? Well, yeah, there were risks here, but whose fault is this? From an insider threat perspective, she's a threat, okay? You could call her careless because she doesn't know. You could call her negligent because she's doing things and maybe she should have gone to her manager to ask the right way to do it. But who's really responsible? Is she responsible as a contractor, or should somebody have made sure she had her tools? And that's one of the biggest challenges we have today, is that when folks come in and we talk about insiders, 50% of the problem is that we're not giving them the tools that they need. And a lot of insiders are just trying to get their job done. So let's take a look at another example. Now, this is Carla, okay? Now, in Carla's case, very similar, all right? She's part of a call center team, and she also is working with confidential data. And in her case, she is putting the data on a personal OneDrive, okay? Same problem. Why is she doing it? Why is she looking at the sensitive data while doing research? It's to get her job done. But from a insider threat perspective, she is accessing data that she shouldn't be accessing and that she shouldn't be putting on her personal OneDrive. So we have two issues here. One, that there's no control in place to stop her from doing it. Two, that she's not properly handling confidential data. But the real issue is that we're going to give her the benefit of the doubt and say she doesn't know better. So calling her careless, if I'm your teammate and I call you careless because you did something that you don't know better, personally, if somebody called me, I'd be offended. So I think taking a look at these and thinking about the other side of the scenario, why did she do it? Did she do it because she was trying to be malicious or steal the data? At that point, if she's trying to steal it, I'm totally on board with calling her malicious. But if she was just trying to get her job done, classifying this user as careless, she's not careless. We as a company were careless. And I got one more. So our last guy is clicking on malicious messages. Now, I included this example not because I wanted to beat the dead horse, but because it's an inherent issue. So in this case, we have a communications team, and every organization, university, public entity, has what you call an external address, like an email. So you go to like support.paypal.com or whatever your university is. They've got all kinds of, they're called shared emails, and they're available externally. And in organizations, there's usually multiple people that read those emails. And you never know what you're going to get when you go get one of these emails, meaning you don't know what to expect because anybody on the internet can actually send to that email address. It's not like you're in finance and you're talking to your colleague and you know what to expect. And so when we train people on how to manage email, the message we usually provide is only open messages from people you know. But if you're on a communications team or one of the teams that supports the email from one of these external shared mailboxes, your job is to open those emails. And this is another thing when we talk about insiders is we've probably got anywhere from 5 to 50% of the malicious issues within an organization come from these shared mailboxes. And so if we're looking at an insider risk, is the risk here because our training wasn't properly effective, or is it because the user didn't know any better? In this case, we're training a user not to open what they don't know, but that training is not, the training's great for a typical employee, but it's not really good for a user that their whole job is to open random emails and respond to them, investigate and route them appropriately. And so the message here is to make sure that you try to put yourself in the other person's shoes and consider it from their viewpoint, because before we call them a threat, there may be a deficit in our process that we need to fix because the problem exists probably elsewhere as well. It's not that one person, it's just the one person you saw. So and I'm going to skip this one, but I think at this point, you guys get the idea that there's a bunch of scenarios where you can get into and you can find an error that looks like you have an insider that's misbehaving, but at the end of the day, it's a combination of training the right way. It's not just, doing a checkbox training, but actually providing the people the information and the tools to do their job that they need. So when we looked at the first image and talked about these people, this is the typical language that we hear from an insider threat team. Or even when Proofpoint talks about our insider threat tool, when we talk about the different scenarios, we use the terms negligent, careless, that the employee is the weakest link. And I think part of the problem is that language. Using that language creates a defensive culture within our employees that already don't like security. And so I think we need to be a little more careful when we reference our peers, because as we discussed in the previous examples, they probably aren't being negligent or careless, and they're not a weak link if they opened a shared email simply because that was their job. It actually is our responsibility to ensure that they've got the tools they need and that they've been trained. And as far as malicious goes, I think when it comes to malicious, the challenge with that is making sure that their credentials haven't been compromised, that what they're doing was intended to be malicious versus it was intended to get a job done. And sometimes it's hard to tell from the data which a person is trying to accomplish. So I wonder how many of you guys, if I had a survey, I would ask, but that was why I put this picture at the beginning, because each of those scenarios I gave you, depending on the perspective you look at it, if you look at it from the employee perspective or you look at it from the security perspective, you would see a different thing. Now, if you take another perspective and you think about it from legal or compliance, depending on in the examples of the data loss, they would have a different perspective. So if we're talking legal and somebody has taken data out of the organization and it's regulated data, there could be other implications of what has occurred that have to be dealt with. It has nothing to do with whether somebody was negligent, but it's all about the data left the company or it got shared with somebody it shouldn't. Then they have to worry about things like notifications. And so each perspective, each person, each responsibility is going to look at these a little differently. And when we're setting up our insider threat, we need to put ourselves in each of those roles so that we can anticipate what is going to be dealt with when we put in some type of monitoring or process, because we need to be prepared to deal with the challenges that are going to come up. So my view on this is, whoa, something happened in my translation of this slide. The text all got big, but you know what? That's okay, because I don't think that terminology should be used. I think that we don't need to be using these. Negligent, a user's not negligent if we didn't show them how to safely share data. A user is not careless if we haven't given them the tools to do their job. And they're not a weak link if the training is not appropriate for their role. And malicious, like I said, what's the policy? Did we train them on the policy? A lot of the malicious users are people who are leading the organization and they're trying to take their data with them. Is it malicious if I've got my tax? I worked 5 zillion hours and I did my tax returns and I'm just trying to get them off. That will probably throw off a data loss protection alarm. But if I'm trying to take company intellectual property, that's malicious. And so it's all about the context. So now let's talk about what the objectives I usually talk through and prioritize for insider threat management. And there are different ways to group these. I group them this way based on the things that a lot of customers care about for compliance. And, it's also kind of a maturity thing for insider threat. So the first thing usually people, when they think of insiders, is data loss. And the thing they usually think of is, I don't want to lose my sensitive data. And the first thing they actually end up seeing is these situations where people are doing personal backups. They're using their personal OneDrives or some kind of other software as a service app that they are sharing. And that's not actually what they were looking for, because in those scenarios, again, the folks haven't been told that their data is already backed up by the organization, and they're using data storage simply because they weren't given the tool to do it, to share with whoever they're sharing with. That's usually the scenario. And then the next thing you see when you do ITM is usually a bunch of unauthorized software. And this is definitely a surprise to most companies that start doing ITM and looking at the data, because it goes back to the people not having the tools. With the emergence of the cloud, there are tons of document converters, image editors, malware scanners, remote access tools. And all of those tools take your data in, and from the user's perspective, they're just trying to, again, get their job done. So let's say I've got a PDF file and I need to get data out of it, but the PDF file is password protected. Most of us at this point have figured out that you can take a password protected PDF file and you can convert it to a Word document. So instead of, not being able to copy and paste something from that password protected file, you can now grab, and oftentimes it's your own organizational document. You're not really trying to steal from somebody else, but so you're just trying to do your job is my message here. You're not trying to steal somebody's data. And all you're trying to do is put it into Word so that you can then reutilize it for company purposes. But in using these online converters, what's happening is that data is being uploaded to wherever it's being hosted. And there have actually been instances where the bad guys will put these popular converters up as free in an effort, and then of course send emails and advertise their availability to targets and use that as a way to collect data. And so sometimes it may just be an innocent company that is trying to be helpful or share. The other times it could actually be an adversary that's trying to get the data. But either way, you don't want your sensitive data up in the cloud unless it's at an approved location. And so this is, like I said, probably the number 2 thing that is unexpected by folks setting up an ITM project. And I think at one company I saw 10 or 11 different brands of online PDF converters. And they also had the image editors and all the other stuff too. But just, I had never seen so many in use at one company before that. And that was pretty eye-opening even for me to see 11 of them. I didn't even know there were that many out there, but I guess it makes sense. There's a type for everybody. And then the next few things you usually do, you've got your IT sabotage, your bypassing security controls, and some people put both of those in the same bucket. But those are important things to be able to do, because if somebody does get in your system, you need to be able to see if they're covering their tracks as well, which is the next to the last one. And then the very last one has to do with counterproductivity. Now, counterproductivity is an interesting one. I have actually seen organizations that want to avoid their users spending all day on the web. And I don't really consider that to be an insider threat activity. I think it's more of an HR concern. What I do think is more of an IT concern is if they're job hunting, it can provide you data on whether somebody's going to leave. Or we've had a lot of instances in the last 2 years with COVID sending people to work from home, where people are actually working 2 jobs because nobody can see them. And they're really only giving half of their attention to each of the jobs, which means an employer is not really getting the benefit of that employee, is the nicest way for me to say that. And so that I do consider an insider threat, kind of. It's more a HR threat though. But the job hunting can be a big deal because when people leave, they tend to try to do the taking things with them. And it'll allow you to put a flag on the account so that you can look a little closer. If an alert comes in from them and somebody else that's not flagged, sometimes these things take a while to look through, and you want to make sure you're looking at the right place. So let's take a look at how you would use this data. Now, when I'm looking at all of these different threat indicators, I like to add it in 3 pieces. So who's a high value target? And what I mean by that is who actually has the access that can do the company damage. They can get to whatever we deem sensitive. If you're a hospital, it could be the health data. If you're a bank, it could be financial data. If you're a school, it could be sensitive data, the student's sensitive data. So it depends on what your type of organization is as to what you consider sensitive. It could also be that has to do with the type of access, meaning do they approve things? Do they have administrative access to applications or to the systems themselves? The other person we like to look at is those that are what we call vulnerable and highly exposed are the other two things we add. So exposed means they get a lot of attacks. So when we talk about attack surface, some people are just, they randomly get spammed because they are on some kind of list. But other folks, like most CEOs, are directly targeted. The CEO of PayPal, PayPal's very visible, just like Apple, Microsoft. A lot of the public figures are very directly targeted, depending on what the threat actor wants to get from them. So it's important to know if whoever the person is targeted. It's also important to know that you don't have to be a CEO to be targeted, though. I've seen people that work in the supply chain ordering down at, just a normal everyday worker that's been a target simply because of their responsibilities, which goes back to their privilege was to make orders and approve invoices. And so and they were just an order clerk, not a manager or an executive of any kind, but they were targeted due to their specialty of their role. And then the last piece I like to look at is vulnerability. And so if we think of vulnerability as, am I highly visible? That's kind of the CEO stuff. What about, am I using vulnerable networks? Am I traveling a lot and I'm on free Wi-Fi? Or do I always work from the office? Or am I working from home and I've got a bunch of different people on the network? Am I at school and I'm using a shared network where it's like the Wild Wild West? And forgive me if anybody, I'm not suggesting Arizona is Wild Wild West, but I do consider a university environment to be a lot more challenging. Thus the Wild Wild West comment, because there are so many types of systems. And that's the other piece. Is the device managed? In a university system, all the student machines are not managed. So you never know if the person sitting next to you in the library is infected. And that's a big challenge. And then the other part of vulnerability is having a history of interacting with malicious content. Now, that could be because they're one of those people that does shared mailboxes, and you could call them targeted simply because historically those have been targeted, and they have no choice but to open the messages. I mean, if that's their job. So I would put those folks as both, usually they're both highly exposed as well as highly vulnerable. Now, those folks also don't have a lot of privilege. So when it comes to being, a high value target, they're not really a high value target, but they are a low hanging fruit, easy target because they have to open it, and it's an easy way in. That's why the attackers use it. So you thinking of the threats based on these ways helps us to identify which teams, if we've got to do some special training, it helps us to see, okay, so my shared mailbox people, they really are getting targeted, and they are. And so that those two reasons alone would explain why they keep opening the emails. And that should feed into your training. And instead of, and it doesn't mean they can't take the standard training, but there should be an appendix or, another 5 minutes at the very least to tell them what's different about them and help recognize differences for teams that the everyday is not enough. So you can take the same approach when you do alerting. When we talk about insider threats, we're usually talking about monitoring the environment. And there are different levels of monitoring that you can turn on, just like there are different levels of security you can apply. And so just like we would group those users to consider how they're targeted and, very attacked, etc., we can take the same profiling approach to figure out how to monitor these folks. So let's say we have a developer and they work on SQL databases all the time, and they use PowerShell. PowerShell is highly targeted. If a developer who's using it or an admin who's using it to do normal work, that's completely normal. But if our everyday user, unless you're a software company and your everyday users do that, but a typical organization, a school, etc., people shouldn't be running things like PowerShell, or there's a long list of administrative tools. So your monitoring, if you profile your monitoring to what is considered a baseline normal, what everybody, it's okay, but then add some exceptions based on things like PowerShell, it will help to reduce your alert fatigue. And what I mean by alert fatigue, for those of you that aren't technical, is when you monitor everybody the same way, you get way more alerts than necessary, because sometimes those alerts are like the PowerShell example, it's part of their normal duties. The same would apply, for example, for, let's say, HR. If we had an alert that says somebody's job hunting, people in HR and hiring managers even often go to look at websites to see what type of descriptions are being used for job postings. It doesn't mean they're looking for another job, but they're looking, that's part of their job to look up those things. And so each organization has a different set of people with normal functions, and to avoid having all of those extra alerts, you have to do a little bit of customization, not suggesting that you have to have every individual role customized, but at least identify your high levels of groups, high-level groups, so that you can figure out what works in your organization. And I'm looking at a note here that says the industry-specific privacy frameworks in the US do not functionally include consent. When it comes to monitoring, consent is a big deal. Consent comes in Europe. Consent is a huge situation, but anytime we're doing insider threat, we have to be sensitive to the fact, just like we should with our language, but sensitive to what we should only monitor what we need to meet our objectives. We shouldn't be bringing in a bunch of extra data that we don't need. And there are concerns with how we use that data. That this is not a privacy activity, so I won't get too deep into that. But from an overarching perspective, it should be treated as any other security product. When a company asks me about, well, am I allowed to do monitoring? My first question back to them is, are you allowed to do DLP? And are you allowed to do web filtering? Because in effect, the data that you're using for ITM is the same exact data. So if you have informed and gotten agreement from your employees to do this monitoring, or if it's part of the requirements of the job, then you have in fact done it. What you can't do though is start doing this if it's not already part of your policies without communicating with your users. And I'm having a problem changing the page, which is why I'm keeping going on with this slide. Bear with me 1 second. They gave me a backup. Let me try my backup. There, my backup worked great. And I can try that again. So let's take a look at some actual threat data. So this data here that you're looking at is actual data that was collected by Proofpoint from July 2021 through June of this year. And what you're seeing on the left is a comparison of the total malicious messages that were sent to three groups, three sub-industries. The first one, the darker blue, is higher education. The second one is academic healthcare. That's like hospitals that are teaching hospitals. And then K through 12. And what's interesting about the one on the left compared to the one on the right, well, I think they're both interesting, but you can see that there's different patterns. I mentioned earlier that different types of people are targeted differently, but this is intended to show you that different industries are also targeted differently. And they're targeted because the bad guys have figured out that who can be attacked for certain reasons and who is more vulnerable to being attacked. And so what you see here, if you look at August on both the delivered and total, you can see that the total number of messages is proportionate to the delivered number of messages. However, if you look at March on the left, you can see that big, huge spike in the higher education. If you look to the right, delivered messages for March, there is no giant spike. So whatever that particular data set was, it was what I consider commodity. A commodity attack is one that the users are well trained for. And so a lot may attempt to come in, but they're very well blocked. The other thing, the difference between these two is it has to do with the configuration of the infrastructure. If you look at the right one where delivered messages, and there are a lot of those, and there are more delivered messages in higher education, keep in mind all of the companies here had the same opportunity for the same protection. And there's differences in delivery due to the fact that they configured the security different. And so what I mean by that is some of them would have bypassed controls and made exceptions for certain groups of people. They would have different safe lists policies. They basically are bypassing your typical security controls. And that's why your delivery differences exist, even when an organization has the same tools available to them, the same technology and ability to block something. If you don't use your configuration correctly, then a malicious message can get to the user, not because the tool's bad, but because your configuration may not be following best practices. So now on this one, let's take a look at a similar set of data, but in this case, this is a threat actors. Now, the threat actors, what this slide is telling you is we're comparing higher education to academic healthcare. And when you're looking to protect your users and train your users, if you know who's attacking you, who typically attacks you, and there are standard trends in the types of threat actors that attack, you can see higher education versus academic, they're very similar, but they're not exactly alike. Down at the very bottom, you'll see those TA and then a 3-digit number. Each of those represents a different threat actor. And then you'll see the 3 bars. The light blue bar is basically saying what percent of messages that the percent of total messages is your dark blue, your light blue is how many are getting in, and then how many are successfully being clicked. And really the point of this slide is that to say the highest volume is not necessarily the ones that will get through and get clicked. They may get delivered, but they won't get clicked. And so looking at those trends to understand who you need to focus on is very important when you're thinking about your threats. The next part of that is once you figure out who's targeting you, is to look at how they're targeting you. So for example, last year there was a lot of talk on XL4 macros. And if you look at this data here on macros, you can see between August and January of last year, there's a certain set of colors where you can see that the HTA and the JavaScript and all of those light pastel, all the threats that were in the pastel color were the ones that were active. But then you can see on the far right, the bright pink and the reddish color. There was a huge change in what the threat actors were doing, and it resulted in them taking a different technique, which effect is what the user saw. So for example, the XL4 macros, there was lots of press on XL4 macros. It started last July and it continued through January. And XL4 macros is a very old technology, but because of all the press, the bad guys started watching and paying attention. They wanted to see who would complain. Microsoft was going to automatically change the policies for those. And because all the press it got, it highlighted the fact to the bad guys that it was a vulnerability. And ever since then, the bad guys have been purposely targeting it because it's not easy for a company to stop using XL4 macros once they exist. And so that's why they became a target. The password protected solution, those have been used for a while. They kind of come in and go out. And then enter silent is another approach that's used. But the point is not which of these is used. The point is that depending on what it is you can tell your users what to look for. Because if they know what to expect, because something's changed from now to 6 months from now, they can be on guard, because an Excel 4 macro is not something you get an email every day. And if you're looking for an Excel, or even if your shared mailbox people suddenly get Excels and that's not normally what they get, they can be extra cautious. Perhaps you could give them another tool so that before they open it, they could scan it. There are definitely ways to do that. You could open it in isolation. So by knowing how your users are being targeted, it gives you the opportunity to take that extra step to protect them. So let's talk about training for a second. Typical training targets are social engineering, malicious URLs, the attachments, data protection, usually at a very high level. All right. And a lot of it is still don't open stuff based on people you don't know. Look at the URL, make sure you recognize it, manually type it in. I'm sure you guys have heard it all if you've taken training. So that's the typical training. Other training that needs to exist is talk about tools. Make sure your employees know about the risks with web-based tools. Not only could they get infected from going to a malware site, but they may be giving away your data and putting it in places that you don't want the data to be. And then when it comes to data sharing, it's the responsibility of the organization to make sure that the employees know the right way to share data and that we enable them to share. I can remember when I was, I don't know if it was Accenture or KPMG, and we were working on providing, I think it was actually a university. We were responding to a request for a price, an RFP, a proposal, request for proposal. And the requirement from the university was that they wanted us to upload this PDF file into their system, and then we were to provide them a copy of it. And I think we had to drop it at the admin office or something. And I don't remember the specifics, but somehow we had to get it on a USB. And because it had pricing and, you know, a solution that was specific for them, our data loss protection solution wouldn't let us put it on the USB. And so we had to work around and figure out a way to do it, which is my nice way of saying we violated company policy to do our job. And you shouldn't put employees in that situation. If their job says, you know, this is the way things have to be done, and when you are trying to get business in consulting, you have to get RFP responses lots of different ways. And so for the people that do that, they have to be given a solution, because if that's how the company's actually functioning, the security folks don't have a job if the company can't continue to run the business. Then the shared mailbox, I think I've hit that one a lot. You can probably tell it's near and dear to my heart. There's nothing worse than being trained on something that doesn't make sense to you, because then it makes you find the rest of your training a little less credible. And then separation management, which when somebody's leaving, whether voluntarily or involuntarily, making sure that our users are trained about what they can and can't do. And even when I left KPMG, which is where I was before here, when I gave my notice, they provided me with a special share that I could upload everything I wanted to download. They did their special data loss protection scan, and it logged everything. And then I just went and downloaded it like I would from a normal share. But they gave me a process so that, I mean, I'd worked there for years. I had personal data. It happens, it's normal. But they recognized that and made sure that instead of doing it in a way they didn't approve of, I would have a way to get my data while they protected theirs. And that's the right way companies need to look at it in order to avoid having misunderstandings, as it's just not fair to blame the users. So when it comes to aligning your security solutions, I really do think you need to think about whether it's a monitoring for an insider threat or the control themselves, you need to look at the risk. You know, back to that, is somebody important? Are they targeted? Are they vulnerable? You know, are they somebody that we need to be concerned, because maybe somebody is going to get their credentials. Credential theft is a big deal. Maybe it's not data. getting their credentials is bad first. So you need to take all of those different scenarios, which that requires you to think of them first, and then make themes, have profiles. And a profile for company A may not even be the same as company B, or university A may have a different profile than university B. So a school that, say, focuses on business may have a completely different requirement than, say, a social, I'm thinking psychology, so behavioral sciences school, because in behavioral sciences, we deal with all kinds of health data. And so there are different requirements that you could have in a business school versus a behavioral sciences school. And that's going to result in different sets of controls that might be required, and processes, and even the tools that they will need to do in order to function. And to make your life easier, keep these groups as simple as possible. Don't try to, I constantly talk about this as at the people level, but we don't want to do it. It's too difficult to administrate if every person had a different set of rules. That's crazy. It's not manageable. Okay, that's why I use the word crazy, because it would be great if we could do that. It's just not tenable to manage it though. So if you can find the happy medium of the groups of users, just like you use groups of users for role-based access control, then you can do the monitoring and the controls that way. I'm trying to watch time. I think I have about 20 more minutes, so we're okay. So let's talk about what risk-based security awareness might look like. All right. So in the scenario I was just talking about, I said, let's do groups of users. And I've given you guys all kinds of examples at this point of what things people might do. But what if they're a repeat offender? How do you address that? And so I like to look at it as a kind of a pyramid. And how deep and how fussy the pyramid is going to be dependent on how much of a risk is involved. Some people only have 2 levels to their pyramid, a level 0 and a level 1, and that is completely okay. I've seen organizations that have 25,000 users and they have 10 people to do security, and that includes the help desk and everything IT. And then I've seen organizations that are 25,000 people that have 250 people to do all of that work. And so I think a lot of that is going to drive how much granularity you have time to implement, because when it comes to security and insiders, there are only so many hours in the day. And these things do require time to implement and monitor them. I see a question. I'll answer it in just 1 second. And so when you look at this, the objective is to define thresholds for what do you do when. So let's say you identify our shared mailboxes. Everybody at level 0 has the same policy. But let's pretend our friends that open those shared mailboxes, communications, whoever they are, because of their situation, we want to put them in level 1, okay? And from a security control perspective, level 1 might mean that their messages stay in a sandbox longer. A sandbox is something that scans bad messages, and the longer it's in there, the higher the likelihood is the bad thing will get caught. So a standard might be 1 minute, maybe they get 3 minutes. It means their mail that's not even expected would be delayed 3 minutes. That wouldn't work for somebody who's sitting at their desk communicating with a customer, but it would work for an external mailbox. And let's say when they do eventually open it, you isolate it so that you isolate it to where they open it in a virtual desktop that can't infect the rest of the company. Great way to handle that type of situation. But then the flip side is the training. So that's the controls, right? So then the training part is, okay, we did everything we could, and they're still going to click on things that bad things happen. If it was a normal user, you might consider them negligent because they keep clicking on things, but you can't have the same rules for those people. And so in a typical user, if they kept clicking on bad things, you might want to increase how often you give them quarterly security training. But if it's somebody whose job says they have to answer and open the emails, that's not a fair thing to do. So what I mean by fair is if it's part of their job, you can't penalize somebody for opening an email when they're required to open it. But for somebody who is just habitually opening risky emails and they've been trained and they just don't seem to take the time to notice obvious things, and I'm not talking about the ones that are not obvious, because there's a lot that are not obvious. So some subjectiveness exists, but you can have systems that, in addition to annual training, maybe you'll do quarterly training, or you could do monthly if they just need a more regular reminder. I've also seen people that every time somebody clicks on something, a phishing test is, or education is automatically triggered. So it doesn't matter who you are, what your job is. If you click on something you shouldn't, we're just going to give you a quick 10-minute reminder, security awareness, training. And I've seen that to be pretty effective. It's just in time training. There's a couple different ways to do that. And there's an immediate one page doesn't seem to be as effective, as in you click, you get the page. It's called a learning moment. That doesn't seem to be very effective. But if you follow up their mistake with a required training that lasts 5 or 10 minutes, that is more effective. So let's see what our question is. It says, in my experience, how has threat intelligence been used to manage insider threat? Curious to hear if it was effective at enriching information or mitigating risk. Okay, well, so threat intelligence is used, and these examples I've been sharing, so all that data trending, and for vulnerability to understand the threats, we can use things like from your email security solution, click rates. You can look at the click rates to see if somebody's doing it. You can look to see who is targeted. You can put those people, like I said, you have there's two sides, right? You've got the security controls, but then you've also got the training part. And training, I consider part of the security control, because you can't really expect somebody to do something you've never trained them on. And there is always the conflict of you've trained them not to do it, but you haven't given them a way to do it right. And that's the other piece. All three pieces have to be in place in order for it to be effective. So effectiveness in training, it's a behavioral thing. Part of my background is in psychology. It's not just information technology and security. And anybody who studies psychology, and any of you who may have children, will know that the first time you tell somebody something, it doesn't necessarily stick. You have to repeat it over and over. And so the reason that the suggestion here is that to increase the periodicness, is that the right way to say it? I guess reduce the time between training is a better way to approach that message. The more often you do something, the more likely you are to have a better recall. And that is becoming truer as we become busier in our lives. We don't have very long attention spans. Everything is getting somebody to sit on a call for an hour. 55 minutes is about the max you've got, which is like why even in this webinar today, there's a 5-minute break between sessions, because you need to kind of shake things out before you go to the next thing. And so doing things in small chunks more often is better than doing them once in large chunks and expecting that somebody will grasp it. It's just totally different when it comes to effectiveness in taking those two approaches. So that is the last slide that I've got for you guys. I was hoping, I left 10 minutes, hoping that you guys might have some questions and I could answer things. Because I do security and we're at a university, I'm happy to answer anything about security. It doesn't even have to be about, unless Donna says that's not okay. It doesn't have to be about insider threats. And I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have about becoming an intern. I look at a lot of intern resumes and I see a lot of good ones, but I also see a lot of really bad ones. I spent the last month going through resumes. I think I hit number 800 today and I've got 300 plus to go. So I can give you some really good examples.
So Deb, you not only have like incredible insights as to what we're actually seeing with these threats, She did some incredible insights, over 800 resumes for our interns. That's pretty great.
I feel bad every time. And so there's a big concern. It's very near and dear to me trying to get women into STEM. And our process is a very unbiased process. But there's no rule that says if I have 800, I can't look at the females first. Or at least, because I'm trying to at least interview as many females as I do guys. And proportionately, I have, it's probably 10 to 1 as far as what I'm receiving, male to female.